There is a place in the world where the air is thick and warm and green, where the light filters down through layers of leaves, softening before it reaches the ground, arriving not as brightness but as a kind of gentle presence, a pale and drifting luminescence that moves slowly across the forest floor as the hours pass. This is the land of the ancient Maya, and it is a place that asks you, quietly, to slow down. The Maya world is large, larger perhaps than many people imagine when they first come to think of it. It stretches across what is now southern Mexico, across the long arm of the Yucatan Peninsula, reaching out into the warm blue waters of the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean Sea, and down through the countries we now call Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. It is a land of great variety, of shifting landscapes, of places where the terrain rises and falls like the slow breath of something old and patient. And within all of that vast and varied geography, there is a quality of stillness that persists, even now, in the quieter corners of that world. In the north, the Yucatan Peninsula stretches out like a flat and ancient table, made of limestone, porous and pale, that was once the floor of a shallow sea. The land there is low and level, and the soil is thin. There are no great rivers running across its surface, because the water, when it falls from the sky in the warm, rainy season, seeps almost immediately down through the soft stone and flows in underground rivers and hidden channels far below the surface. The trees that grow there are low and scrubby and tenacious, their roots finding water in the deep cracks of the limestone. The wind moves gently through them. The light is bright and white, and full of salt from the sea that is never very far away in any direction. Beneath the surface of the northern Yucatan, the underground water sometimes finds its way back to the open air. When the roof of a limestone cave collapses, it creates what the local people have long called a cenote, a deep, round, still pool of water, often perfectly circular, sometimes blue, sometimes green, always quiet and cool and a little otherworldly in the brightness of the Mexican sun. These cenotes were sacred to the ancient Maya. They were, in a sense, doors, openings in the skin of the earth. Places where the surface world and the hidden world beneath met and mingled, where the boundary between one kind of existence and another grew thin and permeable. The Maya left offerings in them. They dropped jade and gold and other precious things into their still, cool waters, and the cenotes received these offerings slowly, letting them drift down through the green darkness to rest on the bottom in the silence. As one moves south and west, away from the flat limestone shelf of the Yucatan, the land begins to change. Gradually, gently, it begins to rise. The trees grow taller. The air grows heavier with moisture. This is the lowland region, a vast and ancient forest that covers much of what is now Guatemala and the southern Mexican state of Chiapas, a place of almost incomprehensible biological richness. The trees here are immense. Ceiba trees, which the Maya considered sacred, which they believed connected the earth to the heavens, rise to extraordinary heights, their great buttressed roots spreading out across the forest floor like the feet of something very old and very patient. Their canopy so high above that it seems almost to belong to a different world than the one below. Beneath them grow layer upon layer of smaller trees, and beneath those, ferns and mosses and orchids and bromeliads, and beneath those, the thick leaf litter of centuries, soft and dark and rich, always slowly composting, always slowly returning to the soil the substance of what it once was. In this lowland forest, the air is rarely still. It is always moving slightly, always carrying with it the scent of growth and decay, the warm mineral smell of wet earth, the sweetness of flowers that bloom high in the canopy and drift their fragrance down like a slow and invisible rain. At dawn, the forest fills with sound, with the calls of birds that live nowhere else on earth, with the low, resonant sounds of howler monkeys that carry for miles through the trees, a sound so low and slow that it feels less like a noise and more like a vibration, something felt in the chest rather than heard with the ears. And then, as the sun rises higher and the heat settles in, the forest grows quieter again. Things find shade. Things rest. The afternoon is slow and still and full of light that comes through the canopy in long, slanted columns, turning slowly as the hours move. In the rivers that flow through this lowland forest, the water is the color of dark tea from the tannins of the leaves that fall into it. It moves slowly. It is warm. Turtles rest on the logs that half submerge in the shallows. Herons stand perfectly still in the water at the edges, waiting with a patience that makes them seem almost like part of the landscape, like pale, long-legged trees that have simply chosen to stand where the water meets the bank. The rivers here were important to the ancient Maya. They provided water, of course, and fish, and a way of moving through a landscape that was otherwise dense and slow to traverse on foot. Canoes moved along these rivers carrying jade, cacao, obsidian, feathers, and all the other things that formed the slow, wide current of Maya trade. Further to the south, the land rises more decisively. The highlands of Guatemala and Chiapas are a place of mountains and valleys, of volcanoes that have shaped the land over vast stretches of geological time, of cool, clear lakes that fill the craters of old eruptions and lie still and blue among the pine forests of the mountain slopes. The air here is thinner and cooler than in the lowlands below. The light is different, cleaner, sharper, the shadows harder edged. The volcanoes are beautiful in a slow, enormous way, the way that very large and ancient things tend to be beautiful, not dramatically, not with any quality of sudden revelation, but with a kind of patient grandeur that accumulates gradually as you look at them, that deepens the longer you sit quietly and allow your eyes to rest on their long slopes and their distant summits. The highland lakes are among the most beautiful places in the Maya world. Lake Atitlan in Guatemala sits surrounded by 3 volcanoes, their reflections lying perfectly still in the water on calm mornings, the surface of the lake so flat and smooth that it seems less like water than like a large, still, gray-blue mirror placed carefully among the mountains. The Maya people who live around the lake today still speak ancient Maya languages. They still wear woven textiles in patterns that have been passed down for generations. They still fish from traditional wooden canoes that move slowly across the water in the early morning light, a thin mist sometimes rising from the surface around them, making the fishermen appear for a moment as though they are floating in a cloud. The first human presence in this part of the world is ancient. People had been moving through the Americas for thousands of years before anything we might call Maya civilization began to take shape. They came through the forests and across the mountains, following the slow migrations of animals and the gradual movement of seasons, finding their way through a landscape that was always changing, always offering new things, new places to stop, new rivers to follow, new forests to move through. The earliest evidence of settled human life in the Maya region dates back to roughly 2000 BCE, perhaps a little earlier in some places, which is to say roughly 4,000 years ago, though human presence in the wider Mesoamerican region is older than that by a considerable margin. These earliest Maya ancestors settled in small villages, usually near water, usually in places where the land was generous enough to support gardens and small fields. They grew maize, which the Maya would always call by a name that suggested it was not simply a food but a kind of foundation, a substance at the center of existence. They grew squash and beans alongside the maize, the three growing together in a combination that was nutritionally almost complete, that had evolved over centuries of careful, patient attention by farmers who understood, without the language of modern science, that these plants helped each other grow. They kept small animals. They gathered from the forest. They lived in homes made of wood and thatch that have long since returned to the earth, leaving almost nothing behind except occasionally the faint impression of a post hole in the soil, or a midden of broken pottery and discarded shells and animal bones that tells us, quietly, that people were here, that they ate and slept and made things and threw things away, as people have always done everywhere. The pottery of these early Maya communities is beautiful in a restrained, unhurried way. It is well made, smoothed and burnished by hand, sometimes decorated with simple incised patterns, sometimes painted in red and black with designs that echo the shapes of the natural world around them. Holding a piece of this pottery even now, even as a fragment in the hand of an archaeologist or in a museum display case behind glass, there is something about it that communicates across the distance of 4,000 years a quality of care, of attention, of someone sitting quietly and working with their hands, pressing their thumbs into warm clay, smoothing the surface, thinking perhaps of nothing very much, or perhaps of the meal that would eventually be cooked in this vessel, or perhaps of nothing at all. Simply working, simply being present to the slow pleasure of making a thing. The landscape itself, over these early millennia, was shaping the people who lived within it just as they were slowly, gradually beginning to shape the landscape. The rainy season and the dry season marked the rhythm of life. The rainy season in the lowlands begins, typically, in May or June, and when it comes thoroughly. The clouds gather in the afternoons, enormous and slow-moving, building up over the warm land and the warm sea until they release their rain in great warm downpours that last for an hour or two before clearing again, leaving the air clean and cool and smelling of wet earth and vegetation. Day after day through the long months of the rainy season the pattern repeats itself, and the land drinks, and the rivers rise, and the crops grow tall, and the whole world turns extravagantly green. In the dry season, the land shifts. The trees in some parts of the lowlands lose their leaves. The rivers fall. The ground cracks in places. The light is harder and more constant, without the soft diffusion that comes with clouds. In the highlands, the dry season brings cold nights, frost in some of the higher places, a quality of clarity to the air that makes the distant volcanoes seem very close and very sharp. And through all of this, through the slow turning of the seasons, year after year, generation after generation, the earliest Maya and their descendants lived and adapted and gradually, unhurriedly, began to build something. The construction of the Maya world was not a sudden thing. Nothing about the Maya story is sudden. It is a long and slow unfolding, a gradual accumulation of knowledge and tradition and skill and spiritual understanding, spread across thousands of years and hundreds of generations of people living their unhurried lives in the forests and mountains and coastal plains of Mesoamerica. The great cities that would eventually rise in the lowland forest, the enormous stone temples and plazas and palaces and ball courts that still stand in places like Tikal and Palenque and Chichen Itza and Uxmal, these did not appear all at once. They grew slowly. They were added to over generations. They were built by ordinary people whose names we will never know, carrying stone and mixing lime and hauling timber through the forest in the heat of the afternoon sun, doing the slow, patient, unglamorous work that creates all lasting things. The land shaped the possibilities. The lowland forest provided building stone in the form of limestone that could be quarried relatively easily, that could be cut and stacked and plastered to create structures of considerable size and permanence. It provided flint for tools. It provided wood for frames and roofs and the wooden lintels that spanned the doorways of temples, and recorded, in carved glyphs, the slow accumulation of royal history. The forest provided food and fiber, and the brilliant feathers of tropical birds that were used in the elaborate regalia of kings and priests. It provided cacao, the seeds of the cacao tree that were used to make a bitter, frothy drink, mixed with chili and vanilla and other flavorings, that was consumed in ritual contexts, that was traded across long distances, that was used as a form of currency, that was considered in the Maya world to be a gift of the gods. The sea, along the coasts, provided fish and salt. Salt was essential, not just as a flavoring but as a preservative, as a way of storing food against the lean months of the dry season, and it was traded inland from the salt works of the Yucatan coast across the whole of the Maya world. The obsidian of the highland volcanoes, a volcanic glass so sharp that a properly made obsidian blade can cut more cleanly than many modern surgical instruments, was traded down into the lowlands where no obsidian naturally occurs, carried along the river routes and overland paths that connected the Maya world into a slow and quiet web of exchange. And across all of this landscape, through all of these generations, something was gradually accumulating. Not just material things, not just buildings and pottery and jade ornaments and cacao, but something less visible, something more gradual. Knowledge, understanding, ways of making sense of the world, ways of explaining the rain and the sun and the movements of the stars, ways of marking time, ways of speaking to whatever powers existed beyond the visible and the tangible, ways of being together in communities, in cities, under kings, guided by priests, surrounded by the slow green abundance of the forest and the slow turning of the seasons, and the slow accumulation of all the days that make a life and all the lives that make a civilization. The earliest period of Maya history, the long stretch of time before the great cities reached their full flowering, is called by archaeologists the preclassic period, and it runs, roughly, from about 2000 BCE to about 250 CE, a span of more than 2,000 years. This is a long time. It is a time that contains within it more change and more human experience than any summary can quite convey, because within those 2,000 years were born and lived and died more generations of Maya people than have lived in the entire subsequent history of the civilization. They left behind their pottery and their garbage middens and the faint traces of their buildings in the earth, and from these quiet remnants, we try to piece together the long, slow story of how a way of life gradually deepened and elaborated and became something that we recognize now as civilization. In the late preclassic period, roughly from about 400 BCE onward, things begin to change in ways that leave more visible traces. Villages grow larger. Some of them begin to develop into something more like towns, with public buildings and ceremonial centers and evidence of increasing social complexity. In some places, truly large construction projects begin. At a site called El Mirador in the lowland forests of northern Guatemala, a city grew to an extraordinary size in the preclassic period, a city whose Great Pyramid, La Danta, remains one of the largest pyramids by volume ever constructed anywhere on Earth. It rises from the forest floor in a series of platforms, each one set back from the one below, reaching upward in slow stages to a height of about 72 meters. From its summit, on a clear day, the forest stretches away in every direction to the horizon, an unbroken green, a vast and quiet sea of trees reaching to the edge of the visible world. El Mirador declined before the Classic period began, for reasons that are still not entirely clear, and the forest slowly reclaimed it, growing over its plazas and temples and courts, filling its rooms with the patient accumulation of leaf litter and root systems, and the slow chemistry of decomposition. And when the great classic Maya cities eventually rose to replace it, they rose in a landscape that already had a long and deep history, a landscape that had already been home to Maya people and Maya culture for more than 1,000 years. They rose slowly, as everything in this story rises, from a deep and ancient foundation. The climate of the Maya lowlands is hot, not aggressively hot, not the dry and punishing heat of a desert, but the warm, enveloping, moist heat of a tropical forest, a heat that wraps around you like something soft, that you feel on the surface of the skin as a kind of constant, gentle pressure. In the shade of the great ceiba trees, the heat is bearable, even pleasant in a drowsy way. The smell of the air is always present, always complex, always carrying in it the memory of recent rain and the promise of future rain, the sweet decay of fallen things, the distant green sharpness of living leaves, the occasional sweetness of a flower somewhere in the canopy above, the mineral earthiness of the soil below. It is air that encourages rest. It is air that makes the body want to be still. In the evenings, the light in the lowland forest turns golden and then orange and then pink, filtering through the trees at a long, slow angle, making the leaves glow as if lit from within. The heat softens. The birds that have been quiet through the hottest part of the day begin to call again. A light breeze, if there is one, moves through the upper branches of the tallest trees. And the sky above the canopy, visible in the clearings and along the river banks, deepens slowly from blue to violet to the first deep dark of night. And then the stars come out. The stars are important to this story. They will become important in the chapters that follow. But even here at the beginning, in the long, slow, formative millennia of early Maya life, the sky above was not simply a backdrop. It was a presence. It was a text. It was something to be read patiently, carefully, over generations, by people whose lives were calibrated to its movements in ways that most people in the modern world have entirely lost. The Maya looked at the sky and saw in it the same patient, unhurried quality that pervades everything in this story. They saw that the stars moved slowly, that the planets moved in patterns that could be tracked and predicted, that the sun rose a little further north or south each morning through the year before slowly turning back, that the moon waxed and waned in its quiet, dependable rhythm. And from all of this, they began to build a way of understanding time that would eventually become one of the most remarkable intellectual achievements of the ancient world. But that is a story for another chapter. For now, let the land rest in your mind. The flat, pale limestone of the north, the dark, warm lowland forest with its enormous ceibas and slow rivers, the cool highlands rising to the south, the volcanoes tall and patient against the sky, the still lakes in their mountain bowls, the rainy season and the dry season turning through the years, the small villages and their cooking fires and their carefully tended gardens and their first, tentative, unhurried steps toward something larger. Let all of it rest there quietly, as the light fades and the stars come out over the ancient forest, and the first Maya look upward into the dark and begin, slowly, to wonder. The land is old. The people who would come to call it home are old. And the story that unfolds across that land over the next several thousand years is long and slow, and full of the kind of ordinary human detail that we can only partly recover, partly glimpse through the pottery and the bones and the crumbling plaster walls, partly imagine from the quality of the air and the light, and the slow turning of the seasons that have not changed so very much since the first villages were settled, and the first maize was planted, and the first careful hands smoothed the first clay into the first vessels that would hold the food and water of the first communities of a civilization that would one day build cities in the forest and red the sky, and count the days with extraordinary precision and leave behind, in stone, a record of their long, patient, unhurried presence in the world. The light is fading now. The forest is settling into its night sounds. Somewhere in the distance, a river moves over its stones with a low, constant, unhurried sound. The air is warm. The leaves are still. And there is time, all the time in the world, to let the rest of the story come slowly, in its own good time, like the dawn that will arrive without urgency over the dark trees, spreading its quiet light gradually across the ancient land. There is something quietly remarkable about the way a city grows from a forest. Not the way a modern city grows, with its noise and its machinery and its sudden transformations of landscape, but the way an ancient city grows, slowly, over centuries, one stone placed upon another, one generation adding what the previous generation began, the whole slow accumulation of human effort and intention rising gradually from the earth like something the earth itself has decided to produce. The great Maya cities grew in exactly this way. They did not appear. They arrived unhurriedly over the long centuries of the classic period, which stretches roughly from 250 CE to 900 CE, a span of 6.5 centuries during which the Maya lowlands filled, slowly and quietly, with some of the most extraordinary architecture the ancient world ever produced. To understand how these cities came to be, it is useful to rest for a moment in the transitional time just before the classic period properly begins, in those last quiet centuries of the preclassic, when something was shifting in the Maya world, when the villages were becoming towns, and the towns were becoming something larger and more complex, when the first stirrings of what we recognize as classic Maya civilization were beginning to make themselves felt in the landscape. It was a gradual process, as all the most important processes in this story tend to be. There was no single moment of transformation, no clear line that one could draw in the earth and say, here, before this point, was one kind of world, and here, after it, was another. Instead, there was a slow deepening, a gradual elaboration of existing patterns, a patient accumulation of knowledge and skill and tradition and social organization that eventually expressed itself in the building of cities. The cities of the classic Maya lowlands are distributed across the landscape in a pattern that reflects the underlying logic of the forest environment. They cluster near rivers and seasonal water sources. They occupy elevated ground where possible, which in the flat limestone lowlands means the subtle rises and ridges that provide perhaps only a few meters of additional height above the surrounding terrain, but that nonetheless offer advantages of drainage and visibility, and a certain quality of prestige that elevated ground has always carried in human societies. Between the great cities are smaller towns and villages connected by roads, some of which were built of raised white plaster, called sakbiab in the Yucatec Maya language, a word that means approximately white roads, and they are exactly that, pale raised causeways that run through the forest, straight and level, connecting ceremonial centers to each other and to the agricultural communities and smaller settlements that surrounded them. Walking one of these roads, or what remains of one of these roads, through the forest today is a quietly affecting experience. The road is still elevated slightly above the surrounding ground in many places, its white plaster surface long since weathered to gray and covered in places by moss and leaf litter, but its straightness persisting, its intention persisting, the human desire to connect one place to another across the patient indifference of the forest still readable in the line of slightly raised ground that stretches ahead through the trees. People walked here. Traders walked here carrying their loads of cacao and obsidian and jade. Messengers walked here, carrying information between cities. Pilgrims walked here, making their way to ceremonial centers for the festivals and rituals that marked the turning of the Maya calendar. All of them are gone now, and the road remains quietly in the forest. Tikal, in what is now northern Guatemala, is perhaps the city that most fully represents the classic Maya achievement in all its patient, accumulated grandeur. It is not the oldest Maya city, nor even the largest at all times during the classic period, but it is one of the most completely excavated, and it is the place where the full scope of classic Maya urbanism is most immediately visible to anyone who walks through it today. The temples of Tikal rise above the forest canopy to heights of between 40 and 70 meters, their steep limestone stairways ascending to small rooms at the top, their roof combs, those elaborate decorative structures built above the roof of the temple chamber to give the buildings additional height and visual presence, reaching still higher into the sky. From the top of the tallest temple, Temple IV, which was built in the 8th century CE and rises to about 65 meters above the forest floor, you can see the other temples rising from the green sea of the canopy below and around you, their gray limestone peaks emerging from the trees like the tips of submerged mountains, the whole vast forest stretching in every direction to the horizon in a long, unbroken green. The construction of these temples was an undertaking of extraordinary patience and scale. The limestone was quarried nearby, cut into blocks, and carried or dragged to the construction site by laborers working under the direction of architects and overseers. The Maya did not use metal tools for their stonework. They did not have the wheel in any practical application. They did not have draft animals to pull loads. Everything was done with stone tools and human hands, and the slow application of organized human effort over many years. The great temples took decades to build, in some cases longer, and they were built in stages, with later construction often encasing earlier structures in a kind of architectural nesting, each new building wrapping around and covering the one before it, so that inside some Maya temples there are entire earlier temples, preserved in the darkness of the limestone that was built around them. The plaster that covered the temples and platforms and plazas of classic Maya cities was made from limestone burned in great kilns and mixed with water to create a hard, smooth, brilliant white surface that reflected the tropical sunlight and could be seen from considerable distances through the forest. A major Maya city in its prime, its buildings freshly plastered and painted in the reds and yellows and blues that the Maya used to decorate their monuments, must have been a remarkable sight, brilliant against the dark green of the surrounding forest, its plazas shimmering in the midday heat, its temples rising in their slow, stepped stages against the blue sky. The colors have faded now. The plaster has weathered and fallen in most places, and the gray limestone beneath gives the ruins a different quality, a softer, quieter, more autumnal beauty that suits the long centuries of time that have passed over them. The plazas at the center of Maya cities were large, open spaces paved in white plaster, surrounded by temples and palaces and administrative buildings, and the tall, flat stone slabs called stelae on which the deeds and genealogies of rulers were recorded in carved relief. The stelae stand in these plazas like tall, narrow presences, their carved surfaces worn by centuries of rain and wind but still legible in places, still carrying the faces of kings and the long columns of hieroglyphic text that tell us, if we can read them, which increasingly we can, something of the lives and claims and concerns of the people who had them made. Standing in a Maya plaza surrounded by these stelae is a quiet experience. The stone is warm from the sun. The air moves gently. The surrounding temples rise on all sides, framing a rectangle of sky above, and the carved faces on the stelae look out with an expression that is neither happy nor sad but simply present, simply there, as the stone itself is simply there, patient and unhurried and enduring. The rulers of classic Maya cities were divine kings, or something very close to it. They held power through a combination of claimed descent from the gods and the ancestors, military success, ritual knowledge, and the ability to maintain the complex web of alliances and obligations that held Maya society together. Their titles, as recorded in the hieroglyphic inscriptions, were elaborate. The most important of them carried the title Kalumt, which seems to have indicated a kind of overlord status, a ruler whose power extended beyond his own city to encompass a wider region. Below them in the hierarchy were lords and nobles who governed subsidiary towns and managed the agricultural and economic resources that sustained the cities. And below them were the farmers and the craftspeople, and the laborers who built the temples and grew the food, and made the pottery and wove the cloth, and did the 10,000 quiet, unglamorous things that allowed the whole elaborate system to function. The lives of ordinary Maya people in the classic period were not so very different, in their basic texture, from the lives of ordinary people in many ancient agricultural societies. They woke early and worked through the cooler morning hours, returning to the shade of their homes during the hottest part of the day. Their houses were made of wood and thatch, built on low earthen or stone platforms that raised them slightly above the wet ground of the rainy season. They were furnished simply, with sleeping mats and ceramic vessels, and the grinding stones on which the dried maize was ground into the masa from which tortillas and tamales were made. The grinding of maize was a daily task, done in the mornings, a slow and rhythmic sound that began before dawn in Maya households and continued for some time as the women of the household worked the stone back and forth, the dried kernels gradually becoming fine powder, the fine powder becoming dough. The diet of classic Maya people was based primarily on maize, supplemented by beans and squash, by the fruits and vegetables of kitchen gardens, by fish and game, by the meat of domestic turkeys and dogs, by wild honey from the stingless bees that the Maya kept in hollow logs, and that produced a honey somewhat different in flavor from European bee honey, darker and more complex, with a slight sourness that complemented the sweetness. Cacao was consumed, but was probably more of a luxury item in ordinary households, reserved for special occasions, while in the courts of kings and nobles it was drunk regularly from tall cylindrical ceramic vessels, sometimes inscribed with texts identifying the contents and the owner, sometimes painted with scenes of courtly life, of feasting and dancing, and the presentation of tribute. The palaces of Maya kings were long, low buildings of many rooms, built on elevated platforms that gave them a commanding view over the plazas and the surrounding city. They were not palaces in the sense of single grand buildings with large, open interior spaces, because Maya architecture was constrained by the corbelled arch, a construction technique in which each successive course of stones projects slightly further inward than the one below, meeting at the top in a point rather than a true arch, which allows the construction of stone-roofed rooms without the need for the keystone arch of European and Middle Eastern architecture, but which also means that Maya interior rooms tend to be long and narrow, sometimes almost tunnel-like, their ceilings rising to a triangular point. Within these long, cool rooms, kings and nobles conducted the business of government and received visitors, and stored the tribute that flowed in from the cities and towns under their authority. The tribute economy of the classic Maya was a quiet but important system. Agricultural produce, luxury goods, labor, and military service all flowed along the networks of obligation and alliance that connected the cities of the lowlands to each other, and to the smaller communities within their spheres of influence. Jade, which the Maya prized above all other materials, came from sources in the Motagua River Valley in what is now Guatemala, and moved through trade and tribute networks across the entire Maya world. Obsidian came from the volcanic highlands. Pyrite, used to make the polished mosaic mirrors that were objects of great ritual significance, came from specific sources and moved through trade. Marine shells moved inland from the coasts. Feathers of the resplendent quetzal, a bird of extraordinary beauty whose long green tail feathers were among the most highly valued luxury goods in Mesoamerica, came from the cloud forests of the highland zones, where the quetzal makes its home in the mossy, dripping trees. The resplendent quetzal is a bird that encourages quietness. It lives in the cloud forests of the Maya highlands, forests that are perpetually draped in mist, where the trees are hung with long streamers of moss, and the air is always cool and damp and smelling of wet wood and lichen. The quetzal male has a body of brilliant iridescent green, a red breast, and tail feathers that can grow to nearly a meter in length, long curved plumes that flow behind the bird as it flies through the forest in a slow, undulating movement, the feathers trailing behind it like a green river in the air. The Maya associated the quetzal with the sky, with wind, with the divine. Its feathers adorn the headdresses of kings and the regalia of priests, and the images of the feathered serpent deity that moved through Mesoamerican religious thought for centuries. Palenque, in the western lowlands of what is now the Mexican state of Chiapas, is a city of a different quality than Tikal. Where Tikal rises in the flat forest, Palenque sits at the base of a range of low hills, with the forest rising behind it up the slopes and a broad plain stretching away before it, and the buildings of Palenque have a quality of lightness and elegance that distinguishes them from the heavier grandeur of the Petén lowland sites. The Temple of the Inscriptions at Palenque is famous for many reasons, but among the quietest and most affecting is the fact that deep within it, reached by a steep internal stairway that descends from the temple floor down through the pyramid's core to a point below the plaza level, there is a burial chamber. And in that burial chamber, when it was first entered by archaeologists in the early 1950s, there lay the sarcophagus of a man named K. Inish Janob Pakal, who ruled Palenque for nearly 70 years, from 615 CE to 683 CE, and who died at around the age of 80, old by any measure, ancient by the measures of the ancient world. The carved lid of Pakal's sarcophagus is one of the great works of Maya art. It shows the king at the moment of death, descending into the underworld, surrounded by the symbols of the cosmic tree and the serpent and the skeletal figures of the death realm, all rendered in a carving of extraordinary skill and delicacy. The lines of the relief so precise and so assured that they communicate across 14 centuries the hand of a craftsperson working with complete confidence, in the service of a tradition they had absorbed so deeply that it had become a kind of second language, a way of thinking as much as a way of making. The sarcophagus was covered in jade. Jade masks and jewelry and ornaments surrounded the body. The chamber was sealed, and the stairway above was filled with rubble, and for 1,200 years the king lay in the cool darkness of the pyramid, undisturbed, while above him the city slowly faded and the forest slowly returned, and the centuries passed in their long, quiet procession. Capan, in what is now Honduras, is the southernmost of the great classic Maya cities, and it has its own particular character. It is known especially for its sculpture, which achieves at Capan a quality of three-dimensional fullness, a sculptural roundness and depth, that is not found in quite the same way at other Maya sites. The stelae at Capan stand in the plaza in front of the Acropolis, their surfaces carved with figures that seem almost to be stepping out of the stone. Their headdresses elaborate constructions of feathers and jade and serpent imagery rising above faces that are individual, specific, particular faces that were once the faces of real people, even if we cannot entirely read them. The hieroglyphic stairway at Capan, a monumental stairway whose risers are covered in carved hieroglyphic text, the longest surviving Maya hieroglyphic text in existence, records the dynastic history of Capan's ruling family across many generations. The cities of the classic Maya were not isolated phenomena. They were deeply interconnected through trade and alliance and intermarriage and occasional conflict, into a network of relationships that extended across the entire lowland region and beyond into the highlands and the coasts. The two great superpowers of the classic period were Tikal and a city called Calakmul, located in what is now the Mexican state of Campeche, and the relationship between these two cities was one of the defining dynamics of the classic period, a slow and complex rivalry that played out over centuries through the medium of alliances with smaller cities and occasional direct military confrontation. The political history of the classic Maya, as we can now read it in the hieroglyphic inscriptions, is full of the familiar human content of political history everywhere. Ambition and alliance, defeat and recovery, the rise of talented rulers and the decline of weak ones, the building of coalitions and the breaking of them, the slow accumulation of power and the sudden reversals that periodically unsettled even the most stable-seeming arrangements. There were wars between cities, marked in the inscriptions with the glyph that scholars call the Star War event, and these conflicts sometimes resulted in the capture and ritual sacrifice of defeated rulers, events that are depicted on monuments with a kind of matter-of-fact plainness that suggests they were understood as a normal and expected part of the political order of the world. And yet, even knowing all of this, the overwhelming impression that the great Maya cities leave is not one of conflict or drama, but of patient, accumulated human effort. The plazas, the temples, the palaces, the ball courts, the roads, the reservoirs, the terraced agricultural fields on the slopes around the cities, all of it represents the quiet labor of many thousands of people working across many generations, contributing their effort to the slow construction of a world that was larger and more complex and more durable than any single life could encompass. There is something deeply affecting about this, something that asks you to pause and consider the enormous patience of which human beings are capable, the way that generations can work together toward a goal that no single generation will live to see completed, contributing their portion, and then stepping aside and allowing the next generation to add its portion, and so on, until the goal is achieved or until circumstances change, and the goal is abandoned or transformed. The ball game was an important institution in classic Maya life. The rubber ball courts found in nearly every significant Maya city, long, narrow playing areas flanked by sloping stone walls, were the sites of a game played with a heavy rubber ball that players were required to keep in motion using their hips and torsos rather than their hands or feet. The game had ritual significance that is not entirely clear to us from this distance, but it was connected in some way to the movement of celestial bodies and to the themes of death and regeneration that run through so much of Maya religious thought. The famous Maya creation text known as the Popol Vuh, which was written down in the 16th century CE, but records traditions of much greater antiquity, tells a story of a pair of hero twins who play the ball game against the lords of the underworld. And the game in the myth is literally a contest between life and death, between the forces of existence and the forces of dissolution. The ball courts in actual Maya cities are quiet places now. The grass grows in them if they are not excavated, or the bare stone of their sloping walls reflects the heat if they are. The rubber ball is gone, decayed back into the earth from which the rubber tree that produced it grew. The players are gone, and the crowds that watched and the lords who presided and the priests who conducted whatever rituals accompanied the game. Only the stone remains, patient and gray and warm in the sun, still holding the shape of its original intention, even though everything that gave that intention meaning has long since departed. The arts of the classic Maya were diverse and accomplished. Painting, sculpture, architecture, ceramics, jade carving, the working of bone and shell and obsidian, weaving, and the production of bark paper books, called codices, in which texts were painted in the fine black ink of the Maya scribe. All of these reached high levels of technical skill and artistic sophistication during the classic period. The murals at a site called Bonampak in Chiapas, painted in the late 8th century CE, and preserved by a lucky combination of limestone sediment that sealed them before they could deteriorate, give us the most complete picture we have of classic Maya court life, showing musicians and dancers and warriors and prisoners and nobles, and the elaborate ritual events that punctuated the calendar year. The colors are still vivid in places, the blues and yellows and reds of the original pigments surviving in the protected interior of the painted rooms, and the figures in the murals are rendered with an assurance and a delicacy that communicates across 12 centuries the achievement of painters working within a tradition of great refinement. The ceramics of the classic period are among the most beautiful objects the Maya world produced. The tall cylindrical vessels painted with scenes of courtly life, figures rendered in fine orange and black line on a cream or orange ground, the compositions organized around the curved surface of the vessel, with a spatial intelligence that manages the challenge of painting on a rounded surface with remarkable ease. The figures in these paintings are recognizable as types, as king and noble and servant and prisoner and deity, but they are also individualized in their postures and expressions. Their hands and faces, rendered with a precision that suggests an artist looking carefully at real people, as well as at the accumulated tradition of how such people are depicted. Some of these vessels were funerary objects, placed in the tombs of nobles and kings to accompany them into the afterlife, and they were sometimes inscribed with a text that identifies them as cacao-drinking vessels, as if to ensure that the dead would have the pleasure of their favorite drink in whatever existence awaited them beyond this one. The Classic period reached its greatest extent and complexity in the 7th and 8th centuries CE. The cities were at their most populous. The inscriptions were being carved in the greatest numbers. The trade networks were most active. The artistic traditions were at their most refined. And all of this was sustained by an agricultural system of considerable sophistication, which included not only the milpa farming of cleared and burned forest plots, that is often the first thing mentioned when Maya agriculture is discussed, but also raised fields in swampy lowland areas, terraced fields on hillsides, kitchen gardens of remarkable diversity, and the intensive cultivation of orchards and managed forest areas that provided a range of useful species. Water management was essential in a landscape where the dry season brought genuine hardship, and the Maya developed systems of reservoirs and canals that allowed them to store the abundant rainfall of the wet season for use through the dry months. The reservoirs at Tikal, for instance, were substantial constructions, carefully lined and managed, capable of holding enough water to supply the city's population through even an extended dry period. The engineering of these systems was accomplished without any of the surveying instruments or material science of the modern world, using instead the accumulated practical knowledge of generations of builders who had learned from their predecessors and added their own incremental improvements and refinements. It is worth resting for a moment in the 8th century CE, at the high point of classic Maya civilization, and simply imagining what it was like to live in one of the great cities. To wake before dawn in a house on the outskirts of Tikal, the air already warm, the first birds already calling in the forest, and to walk through the pale light of early morning along the white road toward the center of the city, where the temples rise against the brightening sky. To hear the sounds of the waking city, the grinding of maize, the movement of people and goods along the roads, the occasional deep resonance of a drum from the direction of the ceremonial center. To smell the smoke of cooking fires mixed with the green scent of the forest and the warm stone of the buildings drying in the morning sun. To arrive in the great plaza at the moment when the first light of the sun reaches the eastern face of the tallest temple and illuminates it in a warm, early glow, while the western side remains still in shadow. This was an ordinary morning in a civilization at its height. The farmers went to their fields, the craftspeople went to their workshops, the scribes went to their writing, the priests prepared for the day's rituals. And the city continued its slow, ongoing life, building on itself, elaborating itself, deepening and extending the traditions and the knowledge and the beauty that it had been accumulating for centuries, unaware, as all civilizations are unaware of what lay ahead, of the gradual changes in climate and politics and social organization that would eventually, slowly, quietly, bring this particular high flowering to its end. The forest was always present. It surrounded every city, pressed in against every cleared field, waited patiently for every road. The ceiba trees grew at the edges of the plazas, their great roots reaching under the plaster floors. Seeds fell from the canopy onto the roofs of the temples. The forest was always waiting with the kind of patience that only very old things possess for its moment to return. And in the 9th century CE, that moment began, slowly and quietly, to arrive. But that is the story of another chapter. For now, let the city rest in the mind. Let the white plazas spread in their quiet heat. Let the temples rise against the evening sky, their shadows long and blue across the pale ground. Let the painted murals glow in the interior darkness of the palace rooms, their colors still bright, the figures in them still moving in their slow, courtly dance. Let the carved faces on the stelae look out over the plaza with their patient, stone expressions. And let the forest stand all around, green and warm and waiting, holding the city in its slow, encircling embrace, as it has always held everything in this land, patient and vast and quietly enduring, waiting for whatever comes next. There is a particular quality to the sky over the Maya lowlands on a clear night. It is a quality that people who live in cities, surrounded by the soft orange glow of electric light, rarely encounter anymore, and it takes a moment of adjustment to fully receive it. The darkness, first of all, is complete. It is not the dark gray of an urban night sky, but an actual, thorough darkness, the kind that has weight and depth and presence, the kind that makes the stars not merely visible but overwhelming, not scattered points of light but a vast, dense, luminous field that seems to press downward toward the earth with a gentle, enormous intimacy. The Milky Way, in such a sky, is not a faint smudge at the edge of perception, but a broad, bright river of light that arches from horizon to horizon, so bright in its densest portions that it casts a faint, perceptible shadow. This was the sky that the ancient Maya looked up at every night. This was the text they read, patiently and carefully, over many centuries, accumulating observations and recording them, and comparing them to the observations of previous generations, and gradually, unhurriedly, building from all of those accumulated observations a picture of the sky's movements of extraordinary precision and depth. The Maya were, among other things, some of the most careful observers of the sky that the ancient world produced, and what they built from their observations was not merely a practical system for tracking the seasons, though it was also that. It was a complete cosmological understanding of the universe, a way of situating human life within the vast, slow movements of the heavens, a framework for understanding what time is and what it means and how it should be counted. To understand Maya astronomy and the calendar, it is helpful to begin not with numbers or mechanisms but with the basic experience of watching the sky. The sun, first of all. The sun rises every morning, and over the course of the year it rises at a slightly different point on the eastern horizon. In the tropics, where the Maya lived, this variation is less extreme than in the higher latitudes, but it is still perceptible, and the Maya perceived it with great attention. At the two equinoxes, in March and September, the sun rises precisely due east and sets precisely due west. At the summer solstice, it rises and sets as far to the north as it will go, and at the winter solstice as far to the south. The annual movement of the sunrise point along the horizon is one of the most basic and observable astronomical phenomena available to anyone who pays attention to it. And the Maya paid attention to it with extraordinary care, building their architecture so that the rising or setting sun at specific moments of the year would align with doorways or windows, or the sight lines between buildings in ways that marked these moments precisely. The sun's passage through the zenith, the point directly overhead, is observable only in the tropics, and for the Maya lowlands there are 2 days each year when the sun, at noon, stands directly overhead and casts no shadow at all. These zenith passage days were important to the Maya calendar and to Maya agriculture, and buildings were sometimes designed with a vertical shaft in the floor through which, on the zenith passage day, a column of noon sunlight would fall straight down to the floor below, a quiet, precise moment of cosmic alignment marked in stone. The sun and the earth and the human intention of the builders all brought together for a moment in a shaft of pure, unhurried light. The moon was equally important. The Maya tracked the lunar cycle with great care, counting the days of each lunar month and comparing them to longer cycles, working out with considerable accuracy the relationship between the lunar calendar and the solar year. The lunar month is approximately 29.5 days, which means that it does not divide evenly into the solar year, and reconciling these two different rhythms is one of the perennial challenges of calendar making in any culture. The Maya developed sophisticated methods for doing this, counting lunar months in groups and developing correction formulas that allowed them to predict with great accuracy the timing of lunar events far into the future. The planet Venus was perhaps the most carefully observed celestial object in the Maya sky, after the sun and the moon. Venus is the brightest object in the night sky other than the moon, and it moves through a cycle that was of deep significance to the Maya, appearing first as the evening star in the west after sunset, then disappearing from view as it passes between the earth and the sun, then reappearing as the morning star in the east before sunrise, then disappearing again as it passes behind the sun, and then reappearing once more as the evening star. This full cycle takes approximately 583 days, and 8 such cycles very nearly equal 5 solar years of 365 days each. This remarkable numerical coincidence, 8 Venus cycles equaling 5 solar years to within a very small margin, was known to the Maya and formed the basis of a calendrical relationship between the Venus cycle and the solar year that was built into their calendar system. The Dresden Codex, one of only 4 Maya books that survived the Spanish conquest and the centuries that followed, contains a Venus table of extraordinary sophistication. The codex itself is a long folded strip of bark paper, painted on both sides in the fine black and red ink of the Maya scribe, and it was made in the post-classic period, perhaps in the 12th or 13th century CE, though it draws on astronomical observations and calculations of much greater antiquity. The Venus table in the Dresden Codex tracks the appearances and disappearances of Venus across a period of 104 years, combining the Venus cycle with the 2 main Maya calendar cycles to create a grand alignment that repeated only once every 104 years. The precision of this table is such that its errors, accumulated over long periods, are smaller than those of some medieval European astronomical texts. Sitting with the Dresden Codex, or with a good reproduction of it, is a slow and meditative experience. The pages are covered in columns of numbers written in the Maya numerical system, interspersed with images of deities associated with specific calendar positions, all rendered in the characteristic style of Maya painting, clean and precise, and somehow both formal and alive. The numbers are written in a system based on 20 rather than the 10 of our own numerical notation, using a combination of dots, which represent ones, and bars, which represent fives, and a shell symbol that represents 0. The Maya had a concept of 0, a placeholder in their positional numerical system, at a time when most of the ancient world had not yet developed such a concept, and this mathematical sophistication was one of the foundations on which their extraordinary calendar system was built. The Maya calendar is not one calendar, but a system of interlocking cycles, each with its own length, each meshing with the others in a complex and beautiful pattern of relationships that the Maya used to locate any given day within a framework of time that extended far beyond any individual human life, far beyond the history of any dynasty or city, into a cosmological past and future of almost incomprehensible depth. The two most fundamental cycles are the Tzolk'in, a ritual calendar of 260 days, and the Hab, a solar calendar of 365 days. These two cycles run simultaneously, like two interlocking gears of different sizes, and any given day has a position in both calendars simultaneously. The combination of the Tzolk'in day name and number with the Hab day name and month creates a designation that does not repeat for 52 solar years, a period the Maya called the calendar round. The Tzolk'in, with its 260 days, is the cycle that is most distinctively Maya, the one with no obvious astronomical counterpart, the one whose origin and significance have been most debated by scholars. 260 days is close to the length of the human gestation period. It is also close to the length of the growing season for maize in some parts of the Maya highlands. It is the period between the two zenith passages of the sun at certain Maya latitudes. It may be all of these things simultaneously, a cycle that resonates with human biology and agricultural practice and celestial observation all at once, which would be entirely consistent with the Maya tendency to weave together the human and the cosmic and the natural into a single integrated understanding of existence. Each of the 260 days of the Tzolk'in has both a number, from 1 to 13, and a name, from a sequence of 20 named days, so that the cycle is generated by running through the 20-day names while also cycling through the numbers 1 to 13, and the combination of name and number does not repeat until all 260 possible combinations have been exhausted. Each of the 20-day names carries its own character, its own set of associations and qualities, its own deity patron. A person born on a particular day carried the character of that day with them through their life, and the day priests, called daykeepers, who maintained the calendar and advised people on the qualities of specific days, were consulted for everything from the timing of planting to the naming of children to the scheduling of marriages and business transactions. The role of the daykeeper in Maya society was one of quiet and continuous service. The daykeeper maintained the count of days without interruption, never allowing the calendar to lapse or lose its place, passing the count from master to apprentice across the generations, so that the unbroken sequence of days was preserved. In the Guatemalan highlands today, in communities where Maya culture has survived in its most continuous form, there are still daykeepers who maintain the Tzolk'in count, who pray at sacred sites on the days appropriate for prayer, who advise people on the qualities of the days of their birth and the days of important events in their lives. The calendar that these contemporary daykeepers maintain is the same calendar that was maintained in the classic period, the same unbroken count of days running forward from the same starting point. And this continuity, across 15 or 16 centuries of the most enormous historical disruptions, is one of the quiet marvels of the Maya story. The Hab, the 365-day solar calendar, is organized into 18 months of 20 days each, with a short period of 5 days called Wayeb added at the end to bring the total to 365. The Wayeb days were considered dangerous and inauspicious, a liminal time between the old year and the new, when the normal protections of ordered time were somewhat weakened. During the Wayeb, people were cautious. They avoided unnecessary activity. They stayed close to home. They waited quietly for the dangerous passage of the unstructured days to end, and for the new year to begin with its ordered sequence of months and days restored. Beyond the calendar round of 52 solar years, the Maya had a third major cycle, the long count, which is the system that attracted so much attention in the years leading up to December 2012, when various popular writers and commentators, drawing on a significant misreading of Maya calendrical thought, claimed that the Maya had predicted the end of the world at the completion of a major long count cycle. The Maya made no such prediction. The long count is a counting system, a way of expressing the position of any given day as a number of days elapsed since a mythological starting date, in the way that our own calendar counts years from a fixed reference point. The starting date of the Maya long count corresponds, in our calendar, to a date in August of 3114 BCE, a date that has no particular astronomical significance, but that the Maya associated with the most recent act of creation, the establishment of the present world order after the failure of previous attempts. The long count counts days in units organized according to the vigesimal, or base 20 system. The smallest unit is a single day, called a kn. 20 kn make a winnow of 20 days. 18 winnow make a ton of 360 days, which is close to but not exactly a solar year. 20 ton make a k-aton of approximately 20 years, and 20 k-aton make a b-acton of approximately 400 years. The great cycle that completed on the December solstice of 2012 was the completion of 13 b-acton, a period of approximately 5,125 years, which the Maya associated with the end of one great age and the beginning of another, not with destruction or catastrophe, but with renewal, with the quiet turning of a vast page in the book of time. The long count is engraved on the stelae and monuments of the classic Maya cities, recording the exact date of every important event in the life of a ruler or city, placing each event within the precise framework of cosmic time. The date on a stela might record, for instance, that on the day that is such and such a position in the long count, which is also such and such in the Tzolk'in, which is also such and such in the Hab, which is also the nth day of the nth lunation, which is also such and such a position in the Venus cycle, King such and such performed such and such a ritual or won such and such a battle. The layering of these different calendrical notations creates a temporal record of extraordinary richness and precision, locating the human event within multiple overlapping frameworks of time simultaneously, situating the specific and the personal within the vast and the cosmic in a single carved inscription. The development of Maya writing is closely connected to the development of the calendar, because the most immediate practical need for writing in the early Maya period was the recording of dates and the events associated with those dates. The Maya writing system is a hieroglyphic system, which means that it uses symbols, called glyphs, that combine phonetic elements with logographic elements, signs that represent sounds and signs that represent whole words or concepts, in a complex and flexible system that can express the full range of a spoken language. Maya writing is, in fact, one of the most complete writing systems developed in the ancient Americas, capable of recording not just dates and titles but poetry and history and myth, and the full texture of human thought and experience. The decipherment of Maya writing has been one of the great intellectual adventures of modern scholarship, and it is still ongoing, still adding to our understanding with each passing decade. The process was slow and difficult, and conducted over many generations of scholars, with key breakthroughs coming sometimes from unexpected directions. One of the most important advances came from the work of a Russian linguist named Yuri Norizov in the 1950s, who demonstrated that the Maya script included phonetic syllabic signs, signs that represented specific syllable sounds rather than whole words, which was a crucial insight that had been resisted by many Western scholars. Norizov worked largely from copies of the few surviving Maya codices, and from a colonial period document that contained a partial description of the Maya writing system. And from these materials, he was able to demonstrate a principle that opened the door to further decipherment. The scribes who produced Maya writing were specialists, members of a learned class who underwent long training in the art of glyph formation and the knowledge of the calendar, and the mythological and historical content that was recorded in writing. The Maya word for scribe was aj-tzib, approximately, one who writes or one who paints, and the same word was used for both writing and painting, because in the Maya tradition these were not entirely separate activities. The scribe and the painter were the same person, working with the same materials and the same training, capable of producing both the fine painted scenes on ceramic vessels and the hieroglyphic texts that accompanied them. Writing was done with a brush made from animal hair or plant fiber, dipped in black ink made from carbon, and the writing surface was either the lime plaster of a building wall or stela, or the bark paper of a codex, which was made by soaking the inner bark of the fig tree, and then beating it flat and coating it with a thin layer of white lime plaster that provided a smooth, receptive surface for the ink. The books that were produced on this material were folded accordion style, each page a section of the long bark paper strip, the whole thing unfolding to a length of several meters, and then folding back together into a compact form that could be stored easily. The loss of the Maya books is one of the quiet tragedies of cultural history. There were many of them. The Maya produced books for many centuries, accumulating knowledge of astronomy and ritual and history, and natural history and divination and medicine and agriculture, and all the other subjects that a sophisticated civilization accumulates knowledge about. The Spanish missionaries who came to the Yucatan in the 16th century burned most of them. The most thorough burning was ordered by a Franciscan friar named Diego de Landa in 1562, at a place called Mani in the Yucatan, where a large number of Maya books and objects of ritual significance were destroyed in what Landa himself described as an act of purification. Landa later expressed some regret about this, and his own account of Maya culture and writing, written to explain and justify his actions, is one of the most important sources we have for understanding the Maya writing system, a document that contains within it both the knowledge that allowed destruction and the knowledge that later helped enable a partial recovery. 4 Maya codices survive. They are housed in Dresden, in Madrid, in Paris, and in Mexico City, where they arrived through paths that are not always entirely clear, acquired at various points after the conquest by European collectors and institutions. They are treated with great care, kept in controlled environments, studied by scholars who recognize in their painted pages the compressed, fragile remains of a literary and scientific tradition of great depth and sophistication. Each page of a surviving codex, when studied carefully, reveals layers of information, layers of calendrical notation and ritual instruction and astronomical data and mythological reference, all organized according to conventions that were once widely understood and that are now only partially recovered, like a language that is mostly but not entirely translated, with gaps where the dictionary is still incomplete. The knowledge contained in the surviving codices and in the hieroglyphic inscriptions on the monuments and buildings of the Maya cities, and in the oral traditions and practices that have been maintained by Maya communities across the centuries, gives us a picture of a civilization with a profound and sustained engagement with the question of what time is and how it should be understood. For the Maya, time was not simply a neutral medium through which events occurred. Time had quality. Different days had different characters, different energies, different potentials for good or ill. The calendar was not just a way of counting days, but a way of understanding the nature of each day, of situating each moment within the vast pattern of cosmic cycles, and understanding what that moment called for and what it cautioned against. This understanding of time as qualitative rather than merely quantitative is one of the things that most distinguishes Maya temporal thought from the modern Western understanding of time as a uniform, neutral flow of moments, each one identical to the ones before and after it, differentiated only by the events that happen to occur within it. For the Maya, no 2 days were identical. Each day was unique in its combination of calendar positions and the qualities those positions carried, and this uniqueness demanded attention, demanded awareness, demanded a kind of alertness to the specific character of each moment that is quite different from the way most modern people move through time. The mathematics that supported all of this calendrical and astronomical work was done entirely in the head and on paper, without any calculating instruments beyond the counting board and the human capacity for sustained mental arithmetic. The Maya mathematicians who worked out the Venus tables in the Dresden Codex, who calculated the corrections necessary to keep their various calendar cycles in alignment with observed celestial phenomena, who tracked the movements of Mars and Jupiter and Saturn across the sky, and found the underlying cycles in those movements. These people were performing feats of extended mental calculation that most people today, accustomed to relying on devices to do their arithmetic, would find difficult to replicate. The observatory buildings found at some Maya sites, most famously the round tower at Chichen Itza known as El Caracol, the snail, for the spiral staircase inside it, were designed with specific astronomical alignments in mind. The windows and doorways of El Caracol are oriented toward the rising and setting points of Venus at its extreme positions on the horizon, and toward other astronomically significant directions, and the building as a whole functioned as an instrument for making and recording precise observations of Venus and other celestial objects. Standing inside the remains of El Caracol, looking out through its remaining window openings at the sky, is a quietly moving experience, because you are standing in a place where people stood many hundreds of years ago, doing something very similar to what you are doing, looking up at the same sky, paying the same patient, unhurried attention to the same slow movements of the same distant lights. The Maya also recorded eclipses. Both the Dresden Codex and the inscriptions on certain monuments include records of solar and lunar eclipses, and the Maya developed methods for predicting when eclipses would occur, based on the careful tracking of the patterns in which eclipses tend to cluster. An eclipse warning table in the Dresden Codex lists the intervals between potential eclipse dates across a period of many years, allowing the user to identify in advance which days should be watched for the possibility of an eclipse. The Maya did not think of eclipses as random or meaningless events. They were moments of particular cosmic significance, moments when the normal relationship between the sun or moon and the earth was disrupted, when the cosmic order was temporarily disturbed and then restored. They called for specific rituals, specific prayers, specific behaviors, all organized according to the calendrical position of the eclipse and the deity associations of that position. The deities of the Maya cosmos were numerous and complexly interrelated. They were associated with specific days and periods in the calendar, with specific directions and colors, with specific natural phenomena and human activities. There were deities of rain and maize and death, and the sun and the moon and the planet Venus and war and trade and writing, and many other aspects of the world. Some deities had multiple aspects, appearing differently in different contexts or at different times of day or year. The great feathered serpent known in Maya tradition as Kukulkan, and among the Aztec as Quetzalcoatl, was one of the most widely venerated figures in Mesoamerican religion, associated with wind and sky and the movement between the heavenly and earthly realms. The underworld of Maya cosmology, known as Xibalba, was a place of darkness and decay presided over by a series of death deities with grim names like One Death and Seven Death, and the deities of pus and jaundice and bone and skull. The underworld was not simply a place of punishment, however, in the way that some religious traditions conceive of an afterlife realm. It was a necessary part of the cosmic order, the place through which the sun passed each night on its journey from west to east before rising again in the morning, the place where seeds descended before sprouting upward into the light. Death in Maya thought was not a terminus but a passage, a transition from one state to another, and the underworld was the domain through which that transition was made. The Popol Vuh, the great Maya creation text from the highlands of Guatemala, written in the Quiche, Maya language in the 16th century using the Spanish alphabet to record a tradition of great antiquity, is one of the most remarkable documents of indigenous American literature. It tells the story of the creation of the world through multiple attempts, the first humans made of mud, which dissolved, the second of wood, which lacked feeling and understanding, and the third, the successful one, of maize dough, the material that could hold the breath of life. It tells the story of the hero twins Hunahpu and Xbalanque, who played ball against the lords of Xibalba, and through cleverness and endurance defeated them, and whose father had been killed by those same lords, and whose resurrection from death set the pattern for the resurrection of the maize plant from the earth each growing season. The Popol Vuh is a text full of the slow, patient rhythms of its subject matter, full of cycles and repetitions and the theme of descent and return, of things going down into darkness and coming back up into the light. The relationship between Maya astronomical knowledge and Maya religious thought is not one of separation, but of profound integration. The movements of the sky were not simply natural phenomena to be observed and recorded for practical purposes. They were the movements of divine beings, the visible expressions of the intentions and interactions of the gods who govern the cosmos. The sun was a deity. The moon was a deity. Venus was a deity. The Milky Way, that great river of light arching across the night sky, was conceived of as the cosmic tree that connected the underworld to the earth and the earth to the heavens, or as the great celestial caiman floating in the primordial waters, or in various other mythological forms depending on context and time and tradition. The sky was alive. It was populated. It was a text written in light, and the Maya read it with the same patient, reverential attention that they brought to all their sacred texts. And so we return to where we began, to that vast, dark, star-filled sky above the lowland forest on a clear night, the Milky Way arching from horizon to horizon, the planets moving slowly against the fixed background of the stars, Venus brilliant in the west or the east, the moon in its patient cycle of waxing and waning. The Maya looked at this sky every night of their lives, as their parents had looked at it, and their parents' parents, back through the generations to the very beginning of their civilization and beyond. They looked at it with attention, with knowledge, with a reverence born of understanding that what they were looking at was not merely scenery but meaning, not merely light but language, not merely the movements of distant objects in a vast and indifferent space, but the ongoing, unhurried, patient communication of a cosmos that was alive and full of intention and speaking, always, to those who had learned to listen. The stars move slowly. The planets drift across the sky in their long, patient cycles. The moon rises and fills and empties and rises again. And beneath all of it, in the dark, warm forest, the ceiba trees spread their enormous arms against the sky, and the rivers move in their slow, tea-colored courses through the roots of the ancient trees, and the night is quiet and warm and full of the soft sounds of things living their unhurried lives in the darkness. And the count of days goes on, as it has always gone on, one day following the next in the long, unbroken sequence that the Maya began counting so long ago that the starting point is lost in the deep past, a thread of time so long and continuous and patient that it makes all the other things in this story seem, for a moment, almost recent. Let the stars rest in your mind now. Let the slow wheel of the night sky turn above the dark forest. Let the numbers rest on their bark paper pages, patient and precise, waiting for the reader who will come. Let the calendar continue its quiet turning, day into day into day, each one unique, each one its own quality of time, each one received and noted and released into the gentle current of all the days that have ever been. The Maya read the sky and found in it a mirror of all the patterns they knew in the world below, the cycles of planting and harvest, of rain and drought, of life and death and renewal. And in that mirror they found something that steadied them, something that placed their brief lives within a framework so vast and so patient that the passage of a single human life was as small and as complete as a single day within the great wheel of the calendar, present fully for its moment, and then gently, quietly, folding into what came after. There is a particular quality to the silence of an abandoned place. It is different from the silence of a place that has always been empty, different from the silence of a forest that has never been disturbed by human presence. The silence of an abandoned place carries within it the faint, residual memory of sound, of voices and footsteps, and the movement of people through spaces that were built to contain them. It is a silence that knows what it is missing. And in the great ruined cities of the classic Maya lowlands, that silence is very old and very deep, and it has been accumulating for more than 1,000 years, settling into the stones of the temples and the plazas and the palaces like a slow, fine sediment, layer upon layer, century upon century, until it has become something almost tangible, almost visible, a presence as real as the limestone itself. The decline of the classic Maya cities is one of the most quietly fascinating subjects in the whole of ancient history. It has attracted the attention of scholars for well over a century, and it has generated an enormous range of theories and explanations and counter-explanations, some of them dramatic, some of them modest, some of them still vigorously debated. But what emerges from the slow accumulation of archaeological and environmental and historical evidence is a picture not of a sudden collapse, not of a dramatic catastrophe that swept through the lowland and extinguished Maya civilization in a moment, but of something much more gradual and much more complex, a long and slow unraveling of the particular social and political and environmental arrangements that had sustained the great cities of the classic period. A process that unfolded across the better part of 2 centuries, and that affected different cities at different times and in different ways. The word collapse, which is the word most commonly used in popular accounts of what happened to the classic Maya, is in some ways a misleading one, because it implies a speed and a completeness that does not quite match the reality of what the evidence shows. What the evidence shows is something slower and more gradual, something more like the way a tide goes out, receding inch by inch from the shore, leaving behind first the outermost rocks, and then the shallower areas, and then the tidal pools, the whole process taking hours rather than moments, and leaving the landscape changed but not destroyed. The forest returned to the cities in something like this way, slowly and steadily, filling the spaces that people had vacated, covering the plazas and the roads and the gardens with the patient, accumulating green of tropical vegetation, returning the stones to their pre-human condition of being simply part of the landscape. To understand what happened in the 9th century CE in the Maya lowlands, it is useful to begin with the landscape itself, with the slow changes that were occurring in the physical environment of the region across the centuries of the classic period. The Maya lowland forest had been substantially altered by centuries of human occupation. The milpa agriculture that formed the foundation of Maya food production required the clearing of forest, the burning of the cut vegetation, the planting of crops in the ashen-rich soil. And then, after a few years when the soil's fertility was exhausted, the abandonment of that plot and the clearing of a new one, while the old plot was allowed to regenerate through a fallow period that might last a decade or more. This system works well when there is sufficient forest relative to population, when each cleared plot can rest and recover before being used again. But as populations grow and the demand for agricultural land increases, the fallow periods shorten, the soil has less time to recover, the forest cover diminishes, and the whole system begins to strain under pressures it was not designed to sustain indefinitely. The populations of the great classic Maya cities in the 8th century CE were substantial. Estimates for Tikal at its height range from around 60,000 to perhaps 100,000 people, including both the urban core and the surrounding agricultural communities that supplied it with food. Similar numbers have been proposed for other large centers. Across the southern lowlands as a whole, the total population during the late classic period may have been in the millions, a density of human occupation that placed enormous demands on the surrounding landscape. The forest was cleared extensively. The soils were cultivated intensively. The agricultural terracing and raised field systems that the Maya developed were responses to exactly this pressure, ways of extending and intensifying food production in a landscape that was reaching the limits of what more casual farming methods could provide. And then the rains began to fail. The evidence for this comes from multiple independent sources. From the analysis of sediment cores taken from lake bottoms in the Yucatan region, which record in their layered deposits the chemical signatures of wet and dry periods across thousands of years, and from the study of stalagmites in caves, which grow in characteristic ways that reflect the amount of rainfall that percolated through the limestone above them, and from the charcoal and pollen preserved in those same sediment cores, which tells us about the vegetation of the surrounding landscape and how it changed over time. All of these different lines of evidence converge on a consistent picture. The 9th century CE in the Maya lowlands was a period of prolonged and severe drought, or rather of a series of droughts, multi-year periods of significantly reduced rainfall that returned repeatedly across the course of the century, and that placed extraordinary stress on agricultural systems that were already under strain from population pressure. A drought in the Maya lowlands is not like a drought in a temperate agricultural region. The tropical forest is so dependent on rainfall, so calibrated to the cycle of wet and dry seasons, that even a moderate reduction in annual rainfall can have significant effects on crop production and water availability. The Maya reservoirs, those carefully engineered storage systems that had sustained cities through normal dry seasons, were not designed to manage the kind of multi-year rainfall deficits that the evidence suggests occurred in the 9th century. As the reservoirs dropped and the wells dried and the rivers shrank, and the crops failed in the unrelenting heat of a tropical dry season that refused to end, the basic arithmetic of survival in a large city became increasingly difficult to balance. But drought alone does not fully explain the pattern of what happened in the 9th century. The decline was not uniform across the lowlands. It affected some cities earlier and more severely than others. It followed patterns that suggest the influence of political and social factors alongside environmental ones. And in some areas, cities continued to function and even to flourish well after the decline had begun elsewhere. The picture that emerges is one of multiple stresses interacting with each other in complex ways, each one making the others harder to manage. The whole system gradually losing its capacity to absorb and adapt to the difficulties it faced. Political instability was one of these stresses. The late Classic period, the 8th and early 9th centuries, was a time of intensifying political competition among the great cities of the lowlands. The long rivalry between Tikal and Calakmul had generated a web of alliances and counter-alliances across the region, and the military conflicts that were the most visible expression of this rivalry had real costs in lives and resources, and the disruption of the agricultural and trade systems that sustained city populations. A city that lost a major conflict and saw its ruler captured and sacrificed faced not just the personal loss of its king, but a crisis of the political legitimacy that depended so heavily on the ruler's ability to maintain the favor of the gods and the success of the community. The construction of new monuments, which had been one of the most consistent activities of classic Maya cities for centuries, recording the achievements of rulers on stelae and the facades of temples, began to slow and then to stop in different cities at different times through the 9th century. The last known long count date carved at Tikal is from 869 CE. At Kapan, the last stela was erected in 822 CE. At Quirigua, a smaller city not far from Kapan, the last monument dates to 810 CE. At Palenque, the most recent dated monument is from 799 CE. These dates do not necessarily mark the exact moment at which each city was abandoned, because people may have continued to live in them for some time after the erection of monuments ceased, but they mark the point at which the political and social order that had motivated and organized monumental construction could no longer sustain that activity. the point at which the resources or the will or the organizational capacity necessary to carve a stela and erect it in a plaza were no longer available. What was it like to live in one of these cities as it slowly quieted? This is a question that the stones cannot fully answer, that the hieroglyphic inscriptions, which were themselves one of the things that gradually ceased, cannot fully answer, that the archaeology can only partially address through what it finds, and what it fails to find in the layers of soil and debris that accumulated in the declining cities. But we can imagine, gently and quietly, something of the texture of it. The population of a city does not decline all at once. It declines the way a tide goes out, gradually, unevenly, with some people leaving early and others staying much longer than seems wise in retrospect, attached to their homes and their fields and the places where their ancestors are buried, and the routines and relationships that make a life feel continuous and coherent even when the larger world is changing in ways that are difficult to understand or to accept. Perhaps the first to leave were those with the resources and connections to establish themselves elsewhere, traders and nobles and craftspeople, who could find places in other cities or communities that were still functioning more fully. Then, as the population declined, and the public works that had sustained the city's water supply and agricultural systems required more people to maintain than were available to maintain them, the conditions for remaining became progressively more difficult, and more people left, and the decline accelerated, slowly at first and then more quickly, the city gradually hollowing out from the inside, the outer residential neighborhoods emptying before the center holding on longest. The great temples and palaces standing in a quieter and quieter city as the years passed, and the forest pressed in from the edges. The forest does not wait to be invited. The seeds of tropical trees are carried by birds and bats and the wind, and they fall everywhere, on the cleared fields and the thatch roofs and the plaster floors of the abandoned buildings. And wherever they fall in a warm, moist environment, they germinate quickly, sending their roots into whatever cracks and crevices are available, finding purchase in the mortar between stones and the accumulated debris of years on the floors of unused rooms. The roots of trees are patient and immensely strong over time, and they work slowly into the stone, following the lines of weakness, widening the cracks, gradually forcing the carefully fitted blocks apart, returning the careful human geometry of the buildings to something more like the organic complexity of the forest. This process takes centuries, but in the warm, wet lowlands it proceeds steadily, and the result, visible today in the unexcavated portions of Maya sites, is a landscape in which building and tree and root are so thoroughly interpenetrated that it is sometimes difficult to say where one ends and the other begins. The famous photograph of the temple at Ta Prohm in Cambodia, its stones wrapped and split and held simultaneously together, and apart by the enormous roots of strangler figs, is the kind of image that comes to mind, though the specific tree species and architectural styles are different. At unexcavated Maya sites throughout the lowlands, very similar scenes are visible: the slow, patient embrace of the forest around the patient, slow dissolution of the buildings, the two forms of patience meeting and mingling in a process that is neither violent nor sad, but simply the way things are, the way that everything returns eventually to the condition from which it came. There is a site in the southern lowlands called Karakol, in what is now Belize, that continued to be occupied longer than many of its neighbors, perhaps sustained by its agricultural terracing systems, and its position within a regional landscape that may have been somewhat less severely affected by the ninth-century droughts. There is Uxmal in the northern Yucatan, whose extraordinary buildings date largely from the ninth and 10th centuries, a time when the great cities of the southern lowlands were already declining, suggesting that political and economic activity was shifting northward, finding new centers in a region where the limestone terrain, for all its lack of surface water, may have been somewhat more resilient to the specific stresses of the period. The Puc Hills of northwestern Yucatan, where Uxmal stands along with a cluster of related cities, produced in the ninth and 10th centuries, some of the most refined and elegant architecture in the entire Maya tradition. Buildings whose facades are covered in intricate stone mosaic work of extraordinary craftsmanship, geometric and zoomorphic patterns worked in thousands of individually cut stone pieces fitted together with a precision that is still astonishing to look at from close up. The buildings of the Puc style have a quality of patient elaboration that is very characteristic of this phase of Maya architecture. The lower portions of the walls are plain, smooth limestone, and then above a medial molding the upper facades erupt into these dense, intricate mosaics of carved stone, masks of the rain deity Chak with their long curved noses stacked at the corners of buildings, geometric lattices and step-fret patterns covering every available surface, the whole composition balanced and rhythmic and deeply considered. The governor's palace at Uxmal, a long, low building on a massive platform, is sometimes considered the finest example of pre-Columbian architecture north of the Great Mexican Plateau, and looking at it in the afternoon light, when the low sun catches the carved surfaces and throws them into sharp relief, it is easy to understand why that judgment has been made. The building has a quality of completeness, of an idea perfectly realized, that communicates across the 11 centuries since its construction a profound architectural intelligence and a tradition of craft at the very height of its powers. Chichen Itza, in the northern Yucatan, presents a more complex picture. It was occupied during the Classic period, but rose to its greatest prominence in the terminal Classic and early post-Classic periods, the 9th through 11th centuries CE, at a time when it was in contact with and influenced by the peoples of central Mexico, particularly the Toltec culture of central Mexico, though the nature and extent of this influence is still debated by scholars. The architecture of Chichen Itza combines elements of the earlier Puc Maya style with new forms that show Central Mexican influence, and the city's iconography includes imagery of warriors and sacrifice, and the feathered serpent deity that has a more martial and imposing quality than the classic lowland Maya style. The Great Pyramid, known as El Castillo, or the Temple of Kukulkan, rises in the center of Chichen Itza's main plaza, a perfectly proportioned stepped pyramid whose stairways total 365 steps, one for each day of the solar year, and whose design is calibrated, so that on the spring and autumn equinoxes the afternoon sun creates a pattern of light and shadow on the northern stairway that resembles a serpent descending from the temple to the ground. This equinox phenomenon at Chichen Itza is experienced today by large numbers of visitors who gather in the plaza in the late afternoon of the equinox days to watch the light change on the pyramid stairway. The triangular shadows cast by the stepped terraces of the building, creating a sequence of diamond shapes along the balustrade of the northern stair, that does indeed suggest the body of a serpent, descending toward the great stone serpent head at the base of the stair. The experience is quiet and slow, the shadow moving almost imperceptibly as the sun descends, requiring patience and attention to perceive, the kind of patient attention that the Maya brought to all their observations of the sky. And then the light shifts, and the shadow changes, and the serpent is gone, and the afternoon continues in its ordinary way, the sun descending toward the western horizon in its unhurried arc. The decline of the classic Maya centers in the southern lowlands did not mean the end of Maya civilization. This point is worth resting on for a moment because the word collapse, applied so readily to this period, can create the false impression that what happened was a terminal event, a final ending. It was not. The Maya did not disappear. They did not die out. They did not cease to be Maya. What declined was a particular configuration of political power and urban organization that had characterized the southern lowland cities during the classic period, a specific arrangement of large cities with divine rulers and intensive agriculture and monumental construction programs and long-distance trade networks. That arrangement became unsustainable under the combined pressures of environmental stress and political instability and social strain, and it slowly dissolved. But the people remained, and their culture remained, and their languages remained, and their calendar remained, and their knowledge of the sky remained, and much of what was most essential and most lasting about Maya civilization remained and continued and adapted and found new forms in new places. In the northern Yucatan, as the southern cities declined, new political configurations emerged. The period that scholars call the post-classic, running roughly from 900 CE to 1521 CE, when the Spanish arrived in force in the Yucatan, saw the continuation of Maya civilization in new forms, with new political centers and new artistic styles and new patterns of trade and alliance. Chichen Itza dominated the northern Yucatan for several centuries before declining in its turn, around 1200 CE, to be succeeded by a city called Mayapan, which was the dominant political center of the northern lowlands through the 14th and into the 15th century. A city of a different character than the great classic centers, smaller and more compact, its buildings less grand, its art less refined in certain ways, but its population dense, and its trade networks active, and its calendar maintained without interruption. The decline of Mayapan in the mid-15th century, around 1441 CE, was more abrupt than the slow dissolution of the classic southern cities, involving an internal revolt against the ruling dynasty and the physical destruction of parts of the city, after which the northern Yucatan fragmented into a series of smaller competing political units. A patchwork of city-states and chiefdoms that were still competing and occasionally fighting with each other when the Spanish arrived in the early 16th century and found a political landscape significantly more fragmented and contested than the great classic cities of 1,000 years earlier had been. In the highlands of Guatemala, Maya civilization had followed its own trajectory, somewhat distinct from the lowland story. The highland Maya kingdoms of the post-classic period, the Kayich, the Kakshikal, the Mam, and others, were complex and powerful polities in their own right, with their own traditions of writing and calendar keeping and architecture and artistic production. The Kayich kingdom, centered at a city called Cuyumarcaj or Uyutlan in the western Guatemalan highlands, was the most powerful of these highland states in the centuries just before the Spanish arrival, controlling a substantial territory and maintaining a sophisticated political and military organization. It was from the Kayich tradition that the Popol Vuh emerged, that great text of creation and myth and dynastic history that was written down in the mid-16th century by K.H. nobles, using the Spanish alphabet to preserve in the new medium of writing a tradition that had previously been maintained in hieroglyphic books, most of which had been or would soon be destroyed. The slow unraveling of the classic period, then, was not an ending but a transformation. It was the dissolution of one form in which Maya civilization had organized itself, and the gradual emergence, in the same landscape and among the same people, of other forms, different in their specifics but continuous in their deeper cultural and intellectual and spiritual substance. The calendar continued to be counted. The languages continued to be spoken. The knowledge of the sky and the land continued to be maintained and transmitted. The stories of the creation and the hero twins and the deities of rain and maize continued to be told in the long evenings in the communities that persisted after the great cities had grown quiet. There is a moment that sometimes comes to visitors at the great Maya sites, a moment that tends to arrive in the late afternoon when the other visitors have gone, and the site is quiet, and the light is long and golden across the stones. It is a moment of a particular, gentle melancholy, a feeling that is not quite sadness and not quite wonder but something between the two, a response to the sheer weight of time that presses down on these places, the weight of all the human lives that pass through them and are gone, the weight of all the days that have accumulated since the last person walked across these plazas in the ordinary course of their daily life. It is a feeling that asks you to be still, to simply be present with the stones and the light and the forest sounds, to allow the long scale of time to rest in your awareness without either dramatizing it or dismissing it. The stones remain, worn and weathered and in many places still half buried under the slow accumulation of centuries of leaf litter and root growth, and the patient chemistry of tropical rain, but remaining, holding their positions, maintaining the shapes that human hands gave them so many centuries ago. The corbelled arches still stand in the interior rooms of buildings that have lost their roofs to time. The carved glyphs on the stelae are still legible in places, still carrying within their weathered surfaces the names of kings and the dates of their deeds, and the claims they made about their place within the cosmic order. The plazas are still flat, still holding the geometry that the Maya builders imposed on the forest, still oriented to the cardinal directions and the rising and setting of the significant stars. And around it all, the forest continues its quiet, patient, ongoing life. The howler monkeys move through the canopy above the temples in the early morning, their low calls resonating through the ancient stones. The toucans and parrots cross the sky above the plazas in bright, casual arcs. The iguanas rest on the warm stones in the midday sun, utterly still, their ancient, patient eyes receiving the light without any apparent surprise or interest. The coati move through the undergrowth in their small, businesslike groups, investigating everything with their long, flexible noses. And the trees grow, always, everywhere, pushing their roots into the spaces between stones, lifting their branches toward the light that filters through the canopy above, participating in the slow, continuous process of growth and decay and growth again that has always characterized this warm, wet, enormously alive landscape. The long unraveling was not a tragedy in any simple sense. It was a transformation, the particular flowering of classic Maya civilization, with its great cities and its divine kings and its extraordinary monuments and its long-distance trade networks, was a remarkable thing, and its passing was a loss of a kind. But the deeper continuities of Maya culture, the languages and the calendar, and the knowledge of the sky and the land and the stories and the ways of being in the world, These did not dissolve with the cities. They persisted, quietly and patiently, through all the centuries of change and disruption and difficulty that followed, carried forward by the people who remained Maya through everything that happened to them, who continued to count the days and plant the maize and look up at the stars, and tell the old stories in the long, quiet evenings of the world. The forest settled back into the spaces that the cities had occupied. The plaster plazas disappeared under the leaf litter of centuries. The painted murals faded in the unprotected rooms of the abandoned palaces. The carved faces on the stele weathered slowly in the tropical rains. And the silence accumulated, layer by layer, year by year, century by century, settling into the stones like a long, slow breath exhaled at the end of a very long day. The silence of completion rather than of defeat, the silence of something that has run its course and rested now, held gently in the patient embrace of the ancient and enduring forest. There is a market in a town called Chichicastenango in the western highlands of Guatemala that takes place every Thursday and Sunday, as it has taken place on those same days, in that same place, for longer than any written record can fully document. It begins before dawn. In the hours when the streets are still dark and the mountain air is cold and sharp, with the smell of pine smoke from the cooking fires of the surrounding villages, people begin to arrive, coming down from the hills along paths they know by feel as much as by sight, carrying their goods in bundles and baskets balanced on their backs and supported by a tumpline across the forehead, the traditional carrying method of the Maya highlands that distributes weight efficiently and leaves the hands free. They come from villages where Kayich, Maya, is the first language spoken at home, where the patterns of the woven textiles identify the community of the wearer as precisely as a written address, where the count of the Tzolk'in calendar is still maintained by the daykeepers who sit quietly at their sacred fires and pray on the days that ask for prayer. By the time the sun has risen over the eastern mountains, and its first light has reached the steps of the great colonial church of Santo Tomás that stands at the head of the market plaza, the market is fully alive. The colors alone are enough to fill the senses completely. The vivid reds and purples and yellows and greens of the woven textiles laid out on the ground and hanging from the stalls. The deep orange of the marigold flowers piled in great fragrant heaps for the altar offerings. The bright red of the tomatoes and chili peppers. The pale green of the chayote squash. The dark brown of the cacao and the coffee. The white of the copal incense that burns in small clay bowls on the steps of the church, where Maya daykeepers perform ceremonies that blend the old and the new in ways that have been developing for nearly 500 years. The smoke of the copal rises slowly in the cool morning air, white and fragrant and unhurried, drifting toward the carved stone facade of the church, and then dispersing into the clear highland sky above. This market, this ordinary and extraordinary weekly gathering of Maya people in a highland Guatemalan town, is where this story arrives after its long, slow journey through the centuries. The Maya are not an ancient people in the past tense. They are a living people in the present tense, approximately 7 million of them, speaking some 30 distinct Maya languages, living across the same broad geographical range that their ancestors have occupied for thousands of years, in southern Mexico and Guatemala and Belize and Honduras and El Salvador. They are farmers and teachers and doctors and lawyers and artists and politicians and scholars and daykeepers and weavers and traders, and all the other things that people are, living their contemporary lives within a cultural tradition of extraordinary depth and continuity that connects them, through an unbroken thread of language and practice and memory, to the civilization that built the great cities in the forest. The continuity of Maya culture through the catastrophic disruptions of the Spanish conquest and the centuries of colonial rule that followed is one of the most quietly remarkable aspects of the entire Maya story. The conquest itself, which began in earnest in the 1520s and unfolded across decades of violence and disease and cultural destruction, was an event of almost incomprehensible severity. The diseases that the Spanish brought with them, smallpox and measles and influenza, and others to which the indigenous population had no prior exposure and therefore no immunity, swept through the Maya communities in waves that reduced the population by estimates ranging from 50 to 90% across the first century of contact. This demographic catastrophe, the scale of which is difficult to fully absorb, was the largest and most devastating single event in the entire history of the Maya people, larger in its immediate human cost than any of the political collapses or droughts or military conflicts of the pre-Columbian centuries. And yet, the languages survived, the calendar survived, the knowledge of the land and the sky survived, the textile traditions survived, the agricultural practices survived, the stories survived, the spiritual traditions survived, transformed and adapted and sometimes expressed through the new forms that the colonial situation imposed, working through the Catholic saints and the ceremonies of the Catholic liturgical year, as well as through the older forms that were maintained in quieter and less visible ways, but surviving nonetheless, persisting with the same patient tenacity that the ceiba tree shows in pushing its roots through the limestone, finding the deep water, holding on. The Spanish colonial system imposed on the Maya people a new religious framework, a new language of administration, a new economic system of tribute and forced labor, and a new social order that placed them at the bottom of a hierarchy determined by race and religion and origin. The destruction of the Maya books was part of a systematic effort to erase the intellectual and spiritual foundations of Maya culture and replace them with Christian doctrine and European learning. Churches were built on top of or directly adjacent to Maya ceremonial centers, their stones sometimes literally recycled from the temples and platforms that the colonial authorities ordered demolished. The large-scale Maya cities of the post-classic period were dismantled, and their populations reorganized into new towns laid out according to the Spanish grid plan, centered on a plaza with a church and a government building, a physical imposition of a new spatial order onto a population that had organized its own space according to entirely different principles. And through all of this, the Maya persisted, not without enormous suffering, not without loss, not without change, but with a fundamental continuity of identity and culture that expressed itself in ways both visible and invisible, both dramatic and quietly ordinary. The invisible ways are in some respects the most interesting, the slow, patient work of cultural preservation that happens not in public monuments or official records, but in the private spaces of family and community life, in the language spoken between grandparents and grandchildren in the kitchen before dawn, in the stories told in the long evenings of the rainy season, in the prayers said quietly at the household altar before the day's work begins, in the knowledge passed from mother to daughter about the plants that grow in the milpa and what they are good for, in the count of the days maintained by the daykeeper who sits alone at the sacred fire on the appropriate day and performs the ceremony that no one else may witness. The weaving traditions of the Maya highlands are one of the most visible surviving expressions of this continuity. Maya women in the highlands of Guatemala and Chiapas continue to weave textiles on the backstrap loom, a simple but remarkably flexible weaving device that consists of two sticks connected by the warp threads of the fabric, one stick attached to a fixed point, and the other to a strap that passes around the weaver's lower back, allowing her to control the tension of the warp by leaning forward or backward. This technology is ancient, and the textiles produced on it are objects of great beauty and cultural significance, their patterns carrying information about the community of the weaver, the occasion for which the textile is made, and the accumulated aesthetic tradition of the community, a tradition that has been developing and elaborating itself for centuries. The colors and patterns of Highland Maya textiles vary dramatically from community to community. In some villages, the predominant color is deep red, the red of cochineal dye made from the dried bodies of a small insect that lives on the pads of prickly pear cactus, a dye that produces colors ranging from pale pink to deep crimson to almost purple depending on the mordant used. In other communities, indigo blue is the dominant color, or the bright yellow of certain plant dyes, or combinations that create the vivid, complex color effects that make Maya textiles instantly recognizable even to people who know nothing of their cultural context. The patterns woven into these textiles, the geometric forms and the bird and animal motifs, and the abstract designs that carry traditional meaning, are learned by young girls as they learn to weave alongside their mothers and grandmothers, absorbed gradually through years of watching and practicing, and gradually taking over more of the work until the full tradition has been transmitted and the new generation can carry it forward. The Maya languages themselves are living things, spoken every day by millions of people in their homes and markets and fields and community ceremonies. The Maya language family is a large and diverse one. Its 30 or so member languages as different from each other, in some cases, as Spanish is from French or German, sharing common ancestry, but having diverged over the many centuries during which the various Maya communities developed in relative isolation from each other. Yucatec Maya, spoken in the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, is perhaps the most widely spoken single Maya language, with well over 800,000 speakers. Quechua, spoken in the western highlands of Guatemala, has a similar number of speakers. Mam, Caxical, Quechua, Tzeltal, Tzotzil, and many others are spoken by communities ranging from a few thousand to several 100,000 people across the Maya region. These are not dying languages, though some of the smaller ones face the pressures that all minority languages face in a world dominated by national languages and mass media, and the economic incentives that push people toward the languages of wider communication. Many of the larger Maya languages are vital and growing, spoken by communities with strong cultural identities and increasing efforts at language documentation, revitalization, and formal education in the mother tongue. In Guatemala, Maya language education has been recognized as a right in the national constitution, and there are schools in which Quechua, or Caxical or Mam, is the medium of instruction alongside Spanish. In Mexico, similar recognition and support exists in principle for the indigenous languages of the country, including the various Maya languages of the South. The daykeepers, those quiet practitioners of the Tzolk'in calendar who maintain the unbroken count of days and advise their communities on the qualities of the days and perform ceremonies at the sacred sites, are still present in the Maya highlands, their practice continuing in communities where the calendar tradition has been maintained without interruption across the centuries of colonial rule and the further disruptions of the 19th and 20th centuries. The training of a daykeeper is a long and gradual process, involving not just the memorization of the calendar and its day associations, but a personal transformation, a deepening of sensitivity and awareness, a capacity to receive and interpret the signs and sensations that come to a person attuned to the day's particular quality. Daykeepers describe this capacity as something that is developed slowly over time, through practice and prayer, and the accumulated experience of sitting with many different days and learning the feel of each one. The sacred sites at which daykeepers perform their ceremonies are found throughout the highlands, on mountain tops, and at the sides of rivers and in caves, and at ancient Maya ruins that have become places of ongoing ritual significance. At these sites, the daykeeper builds a small fire from wood arranged in a specific pattern, and into the fire they place offerings of copal incense and cacao and other substances. And they pray, addressing the days by name, addressing the ancestors, addressing the deities of the four directions and the sky and the earth, maintaining through their quiet, patient ceremony the connection between the present moment and all the moments that have preceded it. The unbroken thread of devotion and attention that runs from the earliest Maya daykeepers through every generation to the present. At the ruins of great classic Maya cities that are now within or near contemporary Maya communities, this ritual continuity is sometimes directly visible. At the site of Iximch in Guatemala, the ruins of the Caxical Maya capital founded in the 15th century, Maya people come regularly to perform ceremonies at the ancient plazas, lighting their fires on the same stones where ceremonies were performed 500 years ago, maintaining a ritual relationship with the place that has persisted through colonization and conversion, and all the changes that the centuries have brought. The smoke of the copal rises from these fires as it has always risen, white and fragrant, carrying its offering upward into the sky above the ancient stones. And the prayers spoken at these fires are addressed to the same powers that the ancestors of these people addressed in the same place in the time before the Spanish came. Powers that have many names and many faces, but that are, at some level, the same presences that have always been honored in this landscape. The Popol Vuh, that great K'ich, Maya text that preserves the creation story and the myth of the hero twins and the dynastic history of the K'ich rulers, was written down in the middle of the 16th century by anonymous K'ich nobles who understood that the books in which this material had previously been preserved were being destroyed, and who used the Spanish alphabet, which they had learned through the colonial system, as a new vessel for the old content, ensuring that the stories would survive in a form that was less vulnerable to the kind of systematic destruction that had been visited on the hieroglyphic books. This act of cultural preservation, quiet and patient and remarkably foresighted, ensured that the deepest stratum of K'ich, Maya intellectual and spiritual tradition, survived into the present, available to contemporary Maya people as a living text rather than a historical artifact. The Popol Vuh is read and taught in Maya communities today. It is the subject of scholarly commentary and artistic interpretation and community celebration. Contemporary Maya writers and artists draw on it as a source and a reference point, a connection to a tradition that extends back far beyond the colonial period into the deep pre-Columbian past. The story of the hero twins, descending into the underworld to play ball against the lords of death and emerging triumphant, resonates for contemporary Maya readers with the same mythological depth that it carried for the people among whom it first took shape, speaking to the universal human experience of descent and difficulty, and the possibility of return, the deep pattern of going down into the dark and coming back up into the light that underlies so much of Maya thought. The relationship of contemporary Maya people to the ancient ruins of the classic period is complex and various, and cannot be reduced to a single simple description. For some Maya communities, the ancient sites are primarily the domain of archaeologists and tourists, and the national heritage agencies of the countries in which they are located, something that belongs to a past that feels distant from the concerns of contemporary life. For others, the connection is felt strongly and personally. The ancient cities understood as the work of their own ancestors, the carved faces on the stelae recognized as the faces of people related to them by blood and culture and spiritual tradition. For the daykeepers who perform ceremonies at ancient sites, the connection is devotional and ongoing. The ruins not a relic of a dead past, but a living sacred landscape, a place where the ancestors are present and accessible to those who know how to approach them properly. The archaeology of the Maya world has itself undergone significant transformation in recent decades, in ways that reflect broader changes in how the relationship between archaeological practice and descendant communities is understood. Maya scholars and intellectuals have increasingly taken leading roles in the interpretation and presentation of Maya history, insisting on the right of Maya people to participate in the study and representation of their own past, rather than having that past studied and interpreted exclusively by outsiders. This shift has enriched the field enormously, bringing perspectives and knowledge that non-Maya scholars did not have and could not easily acquire, deepening the interpretation of the archaeological and textual evidence by connecting it to living traditions of knowledge that have preserved, in transformed form, some of what was in the ancient texts. The technology of LiDAR, which stands for light detection and ranging, has in recent years transformed the understanding of the physical scale of ancient Maya urbanism. LiDAR involves flying an aircraft equipped with laser sensors over an area of forest and using the returned laser pulses to map the terrain beneath the canopy, revealing the shapes of ancient buildings and agricultural features and roads that are invisible from the ground under centuries of vegetation growth. The LiDAR surveys that have been conducted over large portions of the Maya lowlands in the past decade have revealed that the ancient Maya landscape was far more extensively modified and densely occupied than previously understood, with vast networks of causeways and canals and agricultural features connecting cities that were embedded within a continuous, managed landscape, rather than isolated islands in a pristine forest. The scale of the ancient Maya world, seen through these surveys, is quietly astonishing, a testament to the patient, accumulated effort of millions of people over many centuries. In the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, the living Maya communities exist alongside one of the most heavily visited archaeological tourist destinations in the world, the ruins of Chichen Itza, receiving millions of visitors each year. The ancient city embedded within a landscape that is also home to contemporary Yucatec Maya communities, whose members may work as guides and vendors and hotel staff for the tourist industry, while also maintaining the language and some of the cultural traditions of their ancestors. The relationship between the tourist economy of the ancient sites and the contemporary Maya communities is not without its tensions and complications. questions of who benefits from the archaeological heritage, and who controls its presentation and interpretation being among the most persistent of them. But it is also a relationship that has in some ways created new opportunities for Maya cultural expression and economic participation. In Chiapas, in the southern Mexican state where Palenque stands in its forest clearing, and the Tzotzil and Celtal Maya people maintain their communities in the highland towns of San Cristobal de las Casas and Zinacantan and Chamula, and many smaller villages. The living Maya culture is vividly present in the daily life of the towns and markets. The Tzotzil community of Zinacantan, for instance, is known for its weaving traditions, its flower-decorated textiles, and its ongoing practice of a ceremonial life that blends Catholic and pre-Columbian elements in ways that have been developing for 5 centuries, and that represent a genuine and living synthesis, rather than a compromise or a dilution of either tradition. The church ceremonies and the flower offerings, and the ritual drinking of a fermented sugar-cane beverage called pox, and the prayers addressed simultaneously to the Catholic saints and the ancestral deities of the mountains, are all part of a coherent religious life that makes complete sense within its own context, and that has sustained this community through enormous historical difficulties. The milpa, the agricultural system at the heart of Maya life for thousands of years, is still practiced across the Maya region, though it exists now alongside and in tension with other agricultural and economic systems. The planting of maize and beans and squash together in the cleared and burned plot, the tending of the growing plants through the rainy season, the harvest and the storage of the dried grain, the slow return of the forest to the rested plot. This cycle, which is as old as Maya civilization itself, continues in the highlands and lowlands of the Maya world in communities where the land and the labor and the knowledge to practice it are still available. The maize that is grown in these milpas is not the modern hybrid maize of industrial agriculture, but the traditional open-pollinated varieties that Maya farmers have been selecting and maintaining for thousands of years. Varieties adapted to specific local conditions of soil and rainfall and altitude, carrying within their genetics the accumulated wisdom of millennia of careful, patient attention by farmers who understood their plants as intimate companions in the work of living. The taste of a tortilla made from traditional Maya maize, ground on a stone metate and cooked on a clay comal over a wood fire, is different from anything that can be produced from commercial maize flour. It has a depth and complexity of flavor that reflects the particular character of the maize variety, the mineral quality of the stone ground texture, the slight smokiness of the fire, the generations of knowledge embedded in the hands that shaped and cooked it. It is a food that connects the person eating it to a tradition of nourishment that runs back through the centuries to the earliest Maya villages, to the first domestication of maize in Mesoamerica, to the deep human relationship with this plant that the Maya have maintained and honored and expressed in their art and their mythology and their daily practice for thousands of years. The Maya creation story, after all, says that the current humanity was made from maize dough, and in eating this food made in this way, there is something of that origin story being quietly affirmed, the body of the person and the body of the food sharing the same substance, as they have always shared it, as the story has always said they would. The contemporary Maya cultural renaissance, which has been building for several decades, expresses itself in many forms. There are Maya novelists writing in their native languages, Maya poets drawing on the imagery and rhythms of the traditional oral literature to create new work, Maya filmmakers documenting the life and concerns of their communities, Maya linguists working on the documentation and standardization of their languages, Maya scholars publishing research on Maya history and archaeology and linguistics that brings the perspective of insider knowledge to questions that were previously addressed only from the outside. There are Maya radio stations broadcasting in Maya languages, Maya language newspapers and magazines, Maya language websites and social media communities, through which young people scattered across the world maintain connections to their cultural heritage. The young Maya woman who weaves on her backstrap loom in a village in the Guatemalan highlands, while also studying at a university in Guatemala City, and maintaining her connections to her community through a smartphone is not a contradiction. She is a contemporary person, fully of her time, navigating the same complex, layered world that all contemporary people navigate, but doing so from within a cultural tradition that gives her a particular ground to stand on, a particular depth of connection to a place and a people, and a way of understanding the world that is hers in a way that no other tradition could be hers. The depth of that tradition, its antiquity and its continuity and its richness, is something that she carries with her, not as a burden or a limitation, but as a resource, a source of orientation in a disorienting world. The stars over Chichicastenango on a clear highland night are bright and numerous in the clean mountain air. The same stars that the ancient Maya watched from the summits of their temples and their observatory towers. The same slow procession of light across the dark sky that they read so carefully and recorded so precisely and built into their calendar and their architecture and their mythology. The Milky Way arches over the town, over the colonial church with its copal smoke and its flower offerings, over the market that will begin again before dawn on Sunday, over the weaving women and the daykeepers and the schoolchildren and the farmers, and all the other Maya people going about their lives in this place they have occupied for so many thousands of years. The ceiba trees still grow in the highland clearings and along the tropical rivers, their enormous buttressed roots spreading across the ground, their canopy high above spreading its broad arms against the sky. The ancient Maya believed that the ceiba was the axis of the world, the great tree that connected the underworld to the earth to the heavens, the tree at the center of everything, rooted in the darkness and rising toward the light. And looking at a great ceiba tree in the soft light of a tropical afternoon, its trunk so massive that several people could not encircle it with their arms, its roots so enormous and so patient in their slow claim on the ground, its canopy so high and so wide, and so full of the life of birds and epiphytes and insects and small mammals, and all the other things that shelter in its branches. It is easy to understand why the Maya saw in it a model of the cosmos, a visible image of the structure of existence, rooted below and reaching above and sheltering within its embrace everything that lives in the space between. The Maya story is not finished. It is ongoing daily in the lives of the 7 million people who speak Maya languages and maintain Maya traditions and carry forward, in all the quiet, unhurried ways that living cultures carry things forward, the accumulated wisdom and beauty and knowledge of one of the most remarkable civilizations the ancient world produced. It is ongoing in the count of the days, the unbroken sequence of the Tzolk'in that has been maintained without interruption across the centuries, each day following the next in its patient, ordered procession, each one received and honored and released into the slow current of all the days that have ever been and all the days that are still to come. It is ongoing in the maize that grows in the milpas, and the maize that is ground on the stone, and the maize that is cooked on the clay comel, and the maize that is eaten at the family table as it has been eaten for thousands of years. The same food, the same nourishment, the same quiet daily affirmation of the deepest Maya story, which says that this food and this people are made of the same substance, are continuous with each other, are not separate things but one thing. The living expression of a relationship between a people and a plant, and a place that has been developing and deepening for longer than most civilizations have existed. The light is fading now over the ancient forest, as it has faded every evening for the uncountable evenings of Maya history. The howler monkeys are calling in the distance, their low, resonant sound moving through the trees and across the old stones of the temples and out over the dark forest beyond. The first stars are appearing in the deep blue of the eastern sky, the same stars that have always appeared in this order at this hour, patient and unhurried in their ancient positions. The copal smoke is rising from the fire at the sacred site where the daykeeper is completing the ceremony for this day. The words of the prayer drifting upward with the smoke into the cooling air of the evening. Somewhere in a village in the highlands, a woman is finishing her weaving in the last of the afternoon light, her hands moving in the slow, familiar rhythm of the work, the threads pulling tight and releasing and pulling tight again in the pattern she has known since childhood, the pattern her mother knew, the pattern her grandmother knew, the pattern that goes back and back through the generations to a time before anyone now living can remember. A time when the cities in the forest were still cities, and the great plazas were still white, and the stelae were still being carved, and the kings were still performing their rituals under the high tropical sky. And in the city, a young Maya scholar is sitting at a desk with a laptop and a notebook, working through the glyphs of a classic period inscription, reading the words that a scribe carved into stone 1500 years ago, making out the date, and the name and the event recorded there. The long silent text slowly giving up its meaning to the patient attention of someone who has the linguistic knowledge and the cultural connection, and the scholarly training to receive it. Someone for whom this inscription is not merely a historical artifact but a communication from an ancestor, a message sent across the centuries in the patient, enduring medium of stone and waiting, as messages sent in stone always wait, for someone who knows how to read it. The days go on. The calendar turns. The count continues, one day and then another, each one its own quality of time, each one received and honored and released into the great, slow current of all the days that make a civilization and all the civilizations that make a world. The ancient Saba stands at the center of everything, rooted deep in the dark, reaching up toward the stars, its arms spread wide in the warm, still air of the tropical night, holding in its patient embrace the whole long story of the Maya, from the first villages in the forest to the great cities in their prime to the slow return of the forest and the long continuity of the people through everything that came after, all of it resting now in the quiet of the evening, all of it settling gently into the soft darkness of the night, all of it held safely in the ancient, unhurried, enduring world.